When I talk to my patients at the clinic, I see this problem all of the time. They feel overwhelmed with conflicting information about a healthy diet. What they're looking for is a simple, evidence-based guide to know what to put on their plate, and that's what the food pyramid was supposed to be, but it was a bit of a mess, and it was finally abandoned. There's a much better alternative though, and it was developed by the scientists at Harvard, and it's the guide that I share with my patients. So let me explain what it says and unpack some of the research that backs it up. And if you want weekly health research summaries and health strategies that I share with my patients, sign up using the link in the pinned comment. So the food pyramid came out in 1992 and it followed several attempts to represent healthy eating in a graphical form. So for instance, there'd been the basic 7 in the 1940s. So that was a circle divided into 7 food groups with a number of recommended servings for each. So the goal of the 1992 food pyramid was to represent up-to-date knowledge of nutrition, and it tried to visually represent how much of each food group we should be eating. So the things that we should eat the most of were placed at the bottom of the pyramid, and things that we should minimize were placed at the top. And the bottom layer had grains, and it called for 6 to 11 servings daily. The next layer was split between vegetables at 3 to 5 servings daily, and then fruits about 2 to 3 servings daily. Above that were 2 groups at 2 to 3 servings each, and these were dairy and proteins. And then finally, right at the top, signaling the smallest recommended intake, were fats and sweets. And the idea overall seemed great. Visually, it's easy to remember, but as a guide to healthy eating, it is a bit of a disaster. So here's what it got wrong. First, the foundation of the pyramid is grains, but it doesn't specify whole grains, and it describes this group as bread, cereal, rice, and pasta, and the image looks like it contains mostly refined foods. So some people could look at this picture and easily conclude that the foundation of their diet should be white bread, pasta, and white rice. However, lots of evidence says that we should be minimizing refined grains in the diet and boost our intake of whole grains. So we'll return to what a good target is in a moment. Another issue with the food pyramid is at the very top. It groups all fats, oils, and sweets together, and the visual lesson is that all of these are bad and that we should be avoiding them as much as possible. But the reality is way different. We should minimize donuts and candy absolutely, but fats are not all the same. There are healthy and unhealthy fats, and it's a similar problem when it comes to meat, poultry, fish, beans, eggs, and nuts group. So the image doesn't help us distinguish between healthy and unhealthy choices within this broad category. Some people could easily satisfy the recommended amount here by consuming ground beef or sausages, which is not what we want. Increased consumption of red and processed meats have been consistently associated with an increased risk of disease and premature death. And the fourth issue with the food pyramid relates to dairy. So we don't have good evidence supporting the need for 2 to 3 servings daily in our health. And there's no mention here about the kind of dairy that we now know to avoid. Finally, the food pyramid was criticized as its usefulness for a practical guide to planning a meal. Everything here is represented in terms of servings. But how much is a serving? What does 11 servings of grain actually look like on our plate? And to be fair, it wasn't like these issues weren't known about when the concept of the food pyramid first came to light. So if we look at the 1990 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, which informed the pyramid, they're much more careful. So for instance, there's a discussion about the difference between saturated and unsaturated fats, and they recommend keeping saturated fat intake low. But the whole point of a simple diagram is to give the average person an easy way to understand how to eat healthily, and critics consistently pointed out that the food pyramid totally failed in meeting their goal. So the FDA attempted to update it in the early 2000s to address some of these problems, and they ended up abandoning the pyramid altogether in 2011. So is what came next any better? Well, it's definitely an improvement, but there are some things to watch out for. So after I briefly describe it, let's have a look at how researchers at Harvard have updated it to a much better version that's grounded in the most up-to-date evidence. So the food pyramid's replacement is called MyPlate, and visually, it's a simple diagram of a plate divided into 4 sections. So we've got fruit, vegetables, grains, and protein, and off to the side is a cup labeled dairy. And here's what this new version gets right. It's easy to see the right way of what a balanced meal should look like on our plate, and it's much better than thinking through the numbers of servings and then trying to somehow translate those into portions. And it also represents a much better balance. So with the pyramid, the grains at the bottom and visually represent the far larger segment, but here they're about the same size as vegetables and a bit over a quarter of the plate. But we can do better. So the MyPlate website has lots of information which you can read alongside the diagram that adds important clarifications, but most of us in reality, we're not going to read the fine print. What we want is the diagram itself to give us an accurate picture as possible. So scientists at Harvard School of Public Health published a similar image to MyPlate that aims to do just that. It includes a few critical differences, as well as brief text to explain some of the essential points. So let's take a look, and we'll start with protein. So note first of all that they added a key word here. We want to focus on healthy protein. So what does that mean? They steer us towards fatty fish, chicken, beans, legumes, and nuts, which is in line with what we noted about red and processed meats. They say to avoid those. And finally, the portion of the plate taken up by protein is a bit bigger here, and grains is a bit smaller. And this raises an important question. When it comes to a healthy diet, how much protein should we actually be getting? Because there's a lot of controversy surrounding this question. So you've probably noticed the trend. We always hear that we need to be increasing our protein intake. There's protein shakes, there's protein bars, they're everywhere. And the number that you'll often hear that we should aim for is 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of ideal body weight per day. But at the same time, there are opposing voices that say the opposite, that say that we should be lowering our protein intake. So one of the most important is the researcher by the name of Dr. Walter Longo. His suggested target is around the recommended daily allowance of 0.8 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight per day, or even less.
There is no evidence whatsoever that excess protein is good for you.
So why are the recommendations so different? Well, there are good arguments that point in both directions. So there are several reasons why higher protein intake can benefit our health. So for instance, muscle mass is a critical factor as we get older. We start to lose muscle mass as early as our 30s, and then that loss accelerates as we get older, particularly during times of illness and bed rest. And muscle mass can decrease by as much as 50% between the ages of 40 to 80, and strength is connected, of course, to muscle mass. So this is a serious matter. Those declines, they reduce our mobility, they diminish our quality of life, and they can lead to fall-related injuries. And a crucial question here is whether the 0.8 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight per day recommendation is adequate to help us maintain and rebuild muscle mass as we age, because an international group of experts have argued that a higher target of 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight per day for healthy individuals over 65 is a better target. The evidence supports this recommendation. So for instance, an observational study looked at protein intake for adults aged between 70 and 79. So for those with a daily intake of 1.1 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight per day, they lost 40% less lean body mass over the 3-year period compared to those who were taking 0.8 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight per day. And since muscle mass, it begins relatively early in life, it would make sense to raise our protein intakes when we're younger to a level that maximizes muscle gains. And when it comes to building muscle, the target of 1.6 grams that we often hear, it might be a bit high for most people. So a newer meta-analysis uncovered a significant inflection point around the 1.3 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight per day target. Up to that 1.3 level, increasing protein intake had a large impact in terms of increasing lean body mass, but after that, the effects are much more modest. So individuals who are undergoing resistance training, yes, they do continue to see gains above that 1.3 level, but the study shows that we can reap most of the benefits by increasing our protein intake up to 1.3 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight per day. And personally, I aim for 1.2 grams of protein intake per kilogram of ideal body weight per day. But besides muscle mass, there's also the issue of weight management. So obesity is a major risk factor for a whole spectrum of diseases, and studies have found that higher protein consumption can help with weight loss. So one meta-analysis, for example, pulled together the results from trials comparing high protein intake to standard diets. So total calories were the same between the two groups, but the high protein groups, they showed significantly stronger reductions in terms of body weight and fat mass. And what's more, the high protein group, they also gained lean body mass. So why does that matter? Well, because significant weight loss is always accompanied with some degree of muscle loss. So as we've just seen, that's something that we want to avoid. So the evidence that we have about muscle health and weight management both point in the direction for higher protein diets. But what's the argument on the other side? Why does Dr. Walter Longo urge us to keep our protein intakes relatively low? Well, the concern for him is cancer, and one of his most important studies centers on the link between protein intake and cancer and mortality rates. So his team followed up over 6,000 adults over 50 years of age during an 18-year follow-up period, and they divided participants in the study into high, medium, and low protein intakes. And the most eye-opening numbers came from those aged between 50 and 65. So those in the high protein group had a 74% higher risk of all-cause mortality compared to the low-protein group, and they were more than 4 times more likely to die of cancer. So from this study, it looks like higher levels of protein intake can pose serious health risks, particularly when it comes to cancer and mortality. So his work points us to a lower protein intake. But here's the crucial point that surfaces in Dr. Longo's work. The link between protein and cancer, it doesn't seem to be about protein in general. Instead, it's about particular amino acids that are the building blocks of protein, and the amino acid profile depends on the source of these proteins. So in Dr. Longo's study of cancer that we looked at, they found that the negative effects of high protein consumption were mostly a function about how much animal protein was eaten. Plant protein wasn't a problem, so the source here matters, and we see this in other studies too. So in one large cohort study, high intakes of animal proteins boosted mortality risk by a whopping 52%. But higher intakes of plant-based proteins cut the risks by 36%. But not all animal proteins were a problem. In fact, protein from fatty fish was linked to a decreased mortality risk. And in another comprehensive meta-analysis of 32 cohort studies published in the British Medical Journal, it reinforces all of these points because it found that total protein intake was associated with a lower risk of all-cause mortality, and it wasn't associated with an increase in cancer mortality. Plus, once again, plant protein was particularly strongly linked to better health outcomes. And these considerations point us to an important conclusion. It probably isn't total protein that we need to worry about. Instead, we need to make sure that the sources of protein that we choose to eat are healthy ones. So we can increase protein intake above that 0.8 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight per day target to get the gains that we see from higher protein diets without increasing the risks to our health. And this is why I've chosen a protein target of 1.2 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight per day. That's what I personally take, and that's what I recommend to my patients. And in light of Dr. Longo's research, we're probably wise to prioritize plant-based sources and avoid things like red and processed meats. Now, let's have a look at grains. So as with protein, the Harvard plate, it adds a key word here. We want to target whole grains. In the text that explains MyPlate on the USDA website, they say to shoot for about 50% of whole grains. But the advice on the Harvard plate is much better. It says limit refined grains, and ideally we only want whole grains. And the reason is that refined grains, they strip away the fiber and most of the vitamins and nutrients. There's a large body of evidence for whole grains. So for instance, one large cohort study looked at a group of more than 350,000 people over a 14-year period. They assessed how much they ate of whole grains versus refined grains, and they compared this to mortality statistics. So the analysis revealed a striking connection between whole grains and health. So compared to those who ate the least whole grains, those who had the most had a 17% lower risk of all-cause mortality. They also had an up to 48% lower risk of dying from particular diseases. And accumulating evidence shows that fiber present in whole grains is particularly significant. So for instance, a meta-analysis published in The Lancet, it links higher fiber intake with a 15 to 30% decreased risk in deaths of all causes during the study period from heart disease and strokes. And with increased fiber intake, we can also see that it helps with weight loss. So for instance, researchers found an extra 14 grams of fiber per day is associated with a 10% decrease in calories consumed. So this in turn led to a weight loss of 1.9 kilograms, which is about 4 pounds, over the 3.8-month study period. And looking at the available data, it does appear that the more fiber a person consumes, the more benefits they receive, up until a point of course. While fiber is generally great, too much can cause digestive issues like constipation or bloating, so it's important to listen to your body. And to add a bit more nuance to this conversation, people with irritable bowel syndrome, they might actually need a lower fiber intake. So again, there's no one-size-fits-all diet, but for the general population, higher fiber is great, which is why I included 2.5 grams of psyllium husk, which is a potent source of fiber, in Microvitamin Plus powder. But just because I take a supplement does not in any way mean that you should as well. So what about vegetables? Well, the portion size on MyPlate, it looks good. It's the largest section, but there's a common misunderstanding when it comes to vegetables that the Harvard version clarifies. So unfortunately, potatoes, they don't count. Instead, we want a variety of vegetables, including plenty of green ones, like spinach, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, and brightly colored ones, including carrots and tomatoes. Well, tomatoes, of course, is a fruit, but you get what I'm trying to say here. And along with fresh fruit and legumes, these vegetables will help ensure that we get enough of essential vitamins like potassium and magnesium. So potassium in particular can play an outsized role in helping us maintain healthy blood pressures. So one meta-analysis, for example, looked at the results of 22 randomized controlled trials. So the researchers found that increased potassium intake, it reduces systolic blood pressure by about 3.5 units on average. So systolic blood pressure is the higher number that you'll read when you get your blood pressure checked. And when potassium intake reached 3.5 to 4,700 milligrams, the reduction in blood pressure was an amazing 7 units. Now, what about fats? Because they don't show up anywhere on the MyPlate diagram. But in contrast, the Harvard plate includes healthy oils, and it distinguishes healthy and unhealthy fats. So this is a point that for decades doctors got wrong. The message used to be that all fat was bad, but now we know that it isn't. Instead, we've learned that there are certain types of fats that do damage our health. So saturated and trans fats, they can raise cholesterol and increase our risk of heart disease. So studies have shown that swapping out saturated fats for healthier ones, they can drop heart disease rates by about 30%. So trans fats, they often show up in processed foods, and common sources of saturated fats are fatty cuts of meats and whole fat dairy. And a key example of healthy fats is extra virgin olive oil, so it's mostly monounsaturated fats. And many studies have shown the health benefits of adhering to a healthy pattern known as the Mediterranean diet. So extra virgin olive oil is a critical source of fats in that diet. So for instance, the PrettyMed study compared 3 groups over about a 5-year period. One group ate a Mediterranean diet supplemented with nuts, the second ate the same diet but it was supplemented with extra virgin olive oil, and the third group aimed for a low-fat diet. So compared to the low-fat diet group, the olive oil group had a 31% lower rate of heart attacks and strokes. The last thing we'll look at is dairy. So the MyPlate diagram, dairy shows up as a cup beside the plate. This suggests that dairy should be a part of every meal, and it's a great source of protein and calcium, and it also contains other essential nutrients like vitamin A, potassium, and vitamin B12. But MyPlate's recommendation for 3 servings of dairy a day, it doesn't seem to be grounded in good evidence. So it's true that we need calcium and dairy is a good source, but it isn't clear that we need 3 servings daily to get what we need. And this is why the Harvard version, it puts a glass of water next to the plate instead of dairy, and the text also reminds us to avoid sugary drinks, which is an important principle of a healthy diet. So overall, the Harvard interpretation of MyPlate is a fantastic way to structure your diet, and it's the guide that I recommend to my patients. But even though this guide is useful, when I want to make things as easy as possible, I advise my patients to prioritize 3 food types. So we've got a ton of evidence showing that these can increase lifespan and health span. So make sure to check out this next video here for the ultimate shortcut in planning meals to boost your health.